Okay, does this move? Is that okay? Are people here okay? This is really weird being on the stage. Can I tell you, when I normally come into this hall, I'm usually sitting somewhere in the middle, always like a really good seat, because usually my granddaughter is doing her ballet here, and the ballet school use this for the shows, and it's just wonderful. And so I promise I won't dance or even attempt to do any ballet. But good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure tonight to just say a few words of welcome to the Scottish Learning Festival satellite event. And I also want to share that welcome on behalf of my RIC colleagues. You're in the centre of Tayside Regional Improvement Collaborative, and so I share that welcome with my colleagues, Sheena Devlin, who's the Executive Director in Perth and Kinross Council, and also with Kelly, who is our colleague from Angus, and we work very, very closely together. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Audrey May, and I'm the Executive Director of Children and Family Service here in Dundee, but also our Tayside Regional Improvement Collaborative lead. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we affectionately refer to it as the trick. Now, I'm not wanting any feedback on that just now. You can make your own mind up, but we affectionately decide that we're the trick, and it works very well. So as I say, really got great colleagues. Unfortunately, they're not able to be here tonight, Sheena and Kelly, but we do work very closely together. But we also have quite a unique approach to our regional work. We have, our TIC plan is very much based on the Children and Families Integrated Services Plan across 3 areas. So we work very closely also with NHS Tayside and with Police Scotland colleagues who are based in the Tayside area, as well as our social work colleagues across our services. So very, very much a multi-agency and interagency approach. And we think this works really well for us. So since you were visiting the centre of our regional improvement area, we thought we'd just share some headlines with you. So the 5 priority work streams that we have are unlike, the other RICs where there's real focus on learning attainment education. We have 5 priority groups. We have one looking at pre-birth and early years, because we like to go right back to the beginning. We do have priority group 2, and our lead for that, Michelle, is here tonight, and that is our focus on learning attainment, which is a big focus of tonight's event. We also have a priority group looking at health and well-being, and our focus of late has been very much on mental and emotional well-being for the times we've been in, and also child healthy weight, which is a real issue for us across this area. Our priority group 4 and 5 roll together really GIRFIC and the promise, because that's where we deliver our special work around our looked after and care experienced young people, and of course our safeguarding and child protection. And we do a lot of sharing and learning across these areas in order to completely deliver a holistic approach to looking after our children, our young people and our families, and supporting them to improve our outcomes. I really would want to mention, I think it's important, that during the height of the recent pandemic, the partnerships and the collaboration across our RIC really came into sharp focus, and there was an amazing amount of mutual support and alignment of a lot of the work that we tried to do across that time in both Perth and Kinross and Angus and Dundee. So it's just been a joy to work with our colleagues across the RIC, and some of them are here tonight, and I just would just thank them for the work that they do and the work that they support each other in. However, tonight is more focused directly around the education issues, if you like, and so you will hear from the showcased work out there in the discussion tonight, the work that would be around our priority group 2, our learning and attainment group. So a very different approach tonight to the Scottish Learning Festival. Many opportunities to engage online with the Teach Meet style videos and the many webinars and seminars that are out there over these last few days. And in days like this across the country, we also have, and I know last night as well, these mini SLF in-person, face-to-face events. And people are glad to be getting to see each other again. Although sometimes, maybe in terms of the travelling, I'm sure there'll still be a lot of people online, and quite right too. So they're still going to hear and engage in the discussion and the debate. But despite this different approach, the themes remain central to our core business as educators, our core business around learning and teaching, pedagogy, improving outcomes for learners, closing the many various gaps that exist due to disadvantage, and disadvantage could look like a lot of different things as well, and importance of a highly skilled and professionally developed workforce. We know from a wealth of research that teachers must continue to invest in their own learning if we are to improve the outcomes of the children we teach. It's kind of fundamental, isn't it? And my big two go-to quotes that to consistently remind me and constantly remind me of that, when John Hattie talks about visible learning, and we've looked at a lot of that over the last number of years, the remarkable feature of the research evidence is that the biggest effects on student learning occurs when teachers become learners of their own teaching. And of course, McKinsey sums that up, just wrapping it up into that amazing statement. The quality of an educational system cannot outperform the quality of its teachers. The only way to improve outcomes is to improve learning and teaching. You all know that. Very relevant reminders, though, for all of us at an occasion like this. Events such as this can only contribute to that professional learning and development, and that we all need. We all need to be demonstrating and modelling lifelong learning. But the network and the collaboration that comes from these events only adds strength to that and value to that. So really important. So please enjoy the rest of this event, enjoy your evening, contribute to the debate and the discussion, and let's continue to learn from each other, because we do that really well. It's you, our teachers and classrooms, that ultimately make the biggest difference for our learners, for our children. What could be more important than that? I know that's why you're here. Enjoy. Thank you.
I don't need that. They've very kindly given me a small mic, so I won't need to be hiding behind that one. Good afternoon, colleagues, friends, and a warm welcome to everyone who's here with us in Dundee and Angus College, and thank you for taking the time to join us today, either in person here or online. And we really hope that you will be engaged in the debate this afternoon, and we know there's going to be some lively discussion on the issues that surround the Scottish Attainment Challenge and our poverty-related attainment gap in Scotland. I'm Patricia Watson. I'm one of the Strategic Directors with Education Scotland, so a particularly warm welcome from Education Scotland this afternoon. I also have the joy of reminding you of just a couple of particularly that's for those that are in the room, just a couple of housekeeping before we start to introduce our panel here today. Can I just remind people the fire escapes are on either side of you in the doors that you came in. If the fire alarm goes off, go out of those doors and follow the green signs to the exit and out of the building to the car park. And just give a little polite reminder to everyone to make sure that their mobile phones are also on silent or switched off. Thank you very much. So in March this year, the Cabinet Secretary launched a refresh of the Scottish Attainment Challenge with a new mission, a mission that is about overcoming those barriers, but more so helping all of our learners that are most impacted by poverty to achieve the highest level of outcomes that they can in their lives. It's a very new mission statement for the challenge, but it's a really important one for us in Scotland. Today we are joined by a very diverse panel, some very well-kent faces, particularly in the field of talking around poverty-related barriers to learning. And they each bring a very unique perspective to the wide-ranging discussion on attainment, and have so for some time. So we're delighted to welcome you all here to Dundee this afternoon. Can I introduce, first of all, Andrea Bradley. Andrea is a former principal teacher of English and now just recently appointed as the EIS General Secretary. Andrea was previously Assistant Secretary with a responsibility for education and equality. She was also instrumental in designing and setting up and running the PACT project, a joint education, trade union, government initiative which provides vital anti-poverty professional learning for teachers amidst the rising levels of child poverty in Scotland. At the far end of the panel, we have Professor John McKendrick. John is co-director of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit at Glasgow Caledonian University. He has co-edited Poverty in Scotland 2021, Towards a 2030 Without Poverty. High aspirations, I know you have, John, for Scotland in that respect. Much of his recent work explores issues relating to food in schools. Next to Andrea, we have Douglas Hutchison. Douglas is currently Glasgow City Council's Executive Director of Education, was previously Deputy Chief Executive and Director of People at South Ayrshire. And again, having worked in two previous challenge authorities, Douglas has a great passion and a lot of experience in working in all of this field that the Scottish Attainment Challenge focuses on. Next to John at the far end, we have Gemma Walters. Gemma is Principal Teacher of Equity and an English teacher at Smithycroft Secondary School in Glasgow. Building Racial Literacy alumnus and facilitator on cohort 2 and 3 of that Building Racial Literacy programme. She is also a member of the Scottish Association of Minority Ethnic Educators. Next to Gemma, we have Jordan Daly. Jordan is Director of Time for Inclusive Education, TIE. TIE works with schools across Scotland, taking a proactive educational approach to addressing the prejudice and bullying that LGBT young people can often experience. The charity delivers free services including teacher, professional learning and learner workshops, and develops teaching resources. Just interesting, I was talking to people in the audience here in Dundee as we were just gathering this morning, and one of our colleagues had said that Jordan had actually been a huge source of learning in terms of inclusive education, and really looking forward to hearing some of the things that you have to say as well, Jordan. In the centre of our panel is our facilitator today, Steph Toms, who is Director of Curriculum, and she will open and close this session and hopefully be able to corral this experienced panel so that we have a lively discussion and debate, but that we finish on time as well. I'm sure everyone can agree that this is a very important and relevant topic to discuss in Scottish education, and we're really looking forward to listening to the important perspectives that this panel have to share. Near the end of the discussion, Steph will invite questions from the in-person audience here in Dundee and from our online audience. So please be ready with your questions at that time, because we know that this is a topic that everyone is absolutely passionate about in Scottish education. So without any further delay, I'll just pass over to yourself, Steph, and we'll get the debate underway. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Patricia. And on behalf of Dundee and Angus College, I also wanted to extend a very warm welcome to our Kingsway campus here in Dundee. Thanks for coming along to what I'm sure is going to be an extremely valuable discussion with input from our very esteemed panel here. It's great to see people both in person here, and I know lots of people are also joining us online. So thank you very much for your interest and your participation this evening. So I'm just going to get started and get stuck right in. At a time when we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis, I'd like to open the discussion by asking the panel for their views on whether poverty is the #1 barrier to attainment. I'd also like to invite their insight into work already being undertaken to tackle poverty as a barrier to attainment, and for their views on what more needs to be done. So we're starting off with quite a big ask. As co-director of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit at Glasgow Cali Uni, I'd like to direct that question in the first instance towards John.
Thanks very much. I think yes and no is the right answer to the question. If you're one of 750,000 children in Scotland that live in a family that doesn't experience poverty, it's not the most important thing that will shape your education. Flip side, if you're one of the 250,000 children, almost 250,000 children in Scotland, or even perhaps more acutely, if you're one of the 1,000 children, for example, in the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board area, that in this week's Herald newspaper were reported as having malnutrition, a hospital appointment identifying children with malnutrition in Scotland, 1,000 children last year, then absolutely the crisis that engulfs your family undoubtedly will impair your educational experiences. So for individuals, yes and no. Far too many of our young people live in families that experience poverty. If we think about it in terms of schools, again, it's a yes and no answer. If you're a Broughty Ferry primary school, it's perhaps less pressing issue for you than it is if you're a primary school in Fintry or in Lochee. So depending on the school context, it will be more or less of a pressing issue. But I think nationally, in terms of where we want to go as a country, and both Patricia and Audrey mentioned that in their introductions, it absolutely is central to what education should be about and what Scotland should be about. We've got ridiculously ambitious targets for 2030, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with ambition. be that narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap, be that having a proportionate number of our young people from the most deprived areas going to university, or perhaps even more ambitiously at all, the eradicating child poverty by 2030 in Scotland. And that requires education to make a contribution, not to solve it, but to make a contribution, and at the very, very least, not to make things worse. And in terms of the range of activity that has been done and is being done and will be done in education, it's quite phenomenal. I mean, education is perhaps not seen to be the core driver that will eradicate child poverty by 2030, but it's laying the foundations for what Scotland can become. And there's a power of good work, and Andrea's PAC project, you know, the work that's been done with teachers to make more aware of the types of everyday practice that teachers can do. But I think the cost of the school day work is another example, and that's been picked up by schools, certainly in Dundee, one of the leaders in cost of the school day work in Dundee, but throughout Scotland. Incidental, everyday actions that are making a real difference to young people's experiences, and I think most importantly, families' experiences as well, because children are part of families, and unless education can work with families, then we're not really going to overcome the barriers that young people face. So my rather long-winded answer, Steph, to the question is, it's far too big a problem for far too many of our young people, and it's everybody's business to try to do something about that.
And we know it's not the only problem, and it is also interconnected with many of the other challenges around the kind of barriers to attainment. I just wondered, you mentioned about the PACT project, and I wondered, Andrea, whether you wanted to kind of respond to that initial question, and I'm sure part of that answer may be around impact and the other work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks very much. In response to the question about is poverty the biggest or the biggest single barrier that our education system is trying to overcome at the minute, I think it certainly is one of them. And when you look at the relationship between family income and outcomes for young people, then there's a very, very strong correlation between those things. And when we have so many people in Scotland living on or below the poverty line, then the evidence is really stark in suggesting that poverty has to be a really, really serious issue in our education system, and one that our schools and teachers and everybody who's got an interest in education is working together to tackle. So I would say it certainly is a significant issue. We also have to think about the intersectionalities. However, children living in poverty are not homogenous. They come from different kinds of cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. That has to be considered when we're thinking about the solutions or the solutions that schools can deliver, because I think that John's absolutely right to point out that schools, early learning centres, colleges, etc. cannot solve poverty. They can't do that. What we need to equip schools, teachers, all educators to do is to, as best they can, mitigate the impacts of poverty in order that there aren't the diversity of outcomes that there are likely to be unless we make the kinds of interventions that that can minimise some of that. And that brings me to talk about some of the things that have been done already. You mentioned our PACT project. That's a project that's been set up by the EIS in collaboration with the Scottish Government. We call it collaboration with Education Scotland and local authority partners and some academic partners. John's one of them, to provide learning opportunities for teachers so that they can come to understand the nature, the causes, the consequences of poverty, and particularly the consequences of poverty in terms of how that's manifest in the classroom. The way that young people's interactions, their participation, their enjoyment of school, their experiences and their outcomes will be impacted by ultimately, what their family income is, and what their what opportunities they have at home, and what difficulties they have at home. Because, as John pointed out, we have a horrific number of children and young people currently suffering food insecurity. The consequences of food insecurity, food poverty, and actual. Excuse me, I've got a cold just now. Malnutrition. I mean, that set of circumstances is really appalling in a country that is amongst the richest in the world. Almost a fifth of the way through more than a fifth of the way through the 21st century. It's the kind of stories that we have in our minds about Victorian Britain. It really shouldn't be the stories that we're still talking about and coming up against in modern 21st century Scotland. But So we provide that professional learning for our members. We know that in schools and in early learning centres, teachers have been for a long time trying to address the impacts of poverty. It's existed for a long time. It's existed, for more than this cost of living crisis. There was the period of austerity before that. Brought on by the 2008 crash, and there were children living in poverty in significant numbers even before that. So we have things in schools, like the Pupil Equity Fund projects, the Scottish Attainment Challenge projects. We know that there's a lot of good work being done in schools funded by those by those budgets, but we are very concerned about the fact that in some areas those budgets have been cut, and that a lot of that activity, while it's very worthy and very good and is bringing good outcomes to small numbers of children, we would like to see greater investment at the macro level to do things that would make a bigger material difference to young people's experiences and outcomes. So that would be around, for example, additional support needs provision, given the high correlation between incidence of additional support need and incidence of poverty. Things like class size reduction, in order that teachers can have much closer and more meaningful and frequent interactions with young people on a one-to-one or small group basis, because we know from research that those kinds of experiences really do impact on the outcomes of the most disadvantaged young people. So yes, Scotland's aware of its problem. The EIS has done lots of work to make our members aware of the problem, and there's been hyperactivity in Scotland over the last 5 to 10 years around this area. But there is much, much more that we have to do if we're going to really equip schools, early learning centres and colleges like this actually, to do all that they possibly could to mitigate the impact of poverty for the young people, the far too many young people that are experiencing it in this day and age.
Thank you very much. So picking up partly on what John said about the kind of ambitious 2030 targets, and partly what you've said about the work that is ongoing, but the gaps that still exist, I guess I'm interested for views from the panel on whether you think we're doing enough to tackle poverty in Scotland, and whether enough spending is focused on tackling poverty, especially child poverty. And I wondered whether maybe Douglas, you might like to make a response on that.
I don't think you can ever spend enough on eradicating poverty. That's the truth. There's that saying that if you expect to see the solution in your lifetime, you're not asking big enough questions. And I think the eradication of poverty is a massive worldwide lifelong issue. So the short answer is you can never spend enough on it. But that said, in the Scottish context, you do, I would criticise Scottish Government as much as everybody else, but you have to congratulate Scottish Government for the investment that they have put into tackling the poverty-related outcomes gap in an education context. So a huge investment in the last Parliament and a huge commitment to invest in this Parliament. So in terms of investing, putting their money where their mouth is, like Scottish Government are certainly doing that in terms of education. At times they're putting that into a slightly leaky bucket, because as it comes into education at a local authority level, it goes out other places and cuts. So there are challenges there, but there's no doubt there is an investment. Whether it's enough is a whole other question, but you just need to make decisions about what you have available to you, and they have shown a significant commitment to funding how we address the poverty-related outcomes gaps in an educational context. And to go back to your original question about, is poverty number one? I think it is number one. And I agree with Andrea about the intersectionality. So there are some young people for whom it's exacerbated by other characteristics, but I do think it's the number one issue for us to tackle in Scotland. And again, in terms of what's been done, there is a huge amount being done. The Pupil Equity Fund has really empowered head teachers to be able to deal creatively with the issues that they see. In Glasgow, I've only been in about 42 of our, schools, for a walk around and meet the head teacher and go around the school, and I've been hugely impressed by their creativity. They know their children, they know their young people, they know the issues facing their community, and they have the ability to tackle those issues at local level with a degree of creativity. And the Pupil Equity Fund, for example, gives them that creativity. So in terms of resource, they're able to tackle things head on in a creative way at a local level, I would say. So anyway, I'll stop now and let other folk come in.
No, thanks, Douglas. And I guess I wonder in terms of that, so there are, you're right, there has been a huge commitment and there is a lot of investment and some excellent examples of practice. I guess I'm interested either from yourself or others in the panel if we feel like the approach is joined up enough. So we have examples of good practice and we have lots of great work going on, but Scotland-wide, are we joining up services, data, information and our insight enough to be tackling it? So either open that up to the panel or happy for you to respond to that, Douglas.
I think that we are in some ways. I think that efforts are made to share examples of good practice, to gather examples of good practice and to share those examples of good practice. There maybe isn't always the time for teachers to collaborate around good practice and to try and learn from one another about what works well and maybe what works less well. And of course that's all context based anyway. But I do think that there are elements of policy collision at government level. So for example, there is, we have government policy around free school meals that makes provision for P1 to P5, P6 and 7. There's going to be a delay. There is now going to be a delay to the rollout for P6 and P7, and very, very little in the planning to extend that to secondary-aged young people. And we know that hunger and poverty, don't stop at age 12. Those kinds of experiences and challenges extend to, young people of all ages. So we think that there really does have to be an acceleration of efforts around making sure that children are fed every day in school, if not by sitting down in a canteen and eating a meal with their peers, through some other means, the kind of which we saw during the early stages of the pandemic, when local authorities in particular worked very creatively to make sure that every single child who was entitled to a free meal got access at least to that when schools were closed. And I think that we have to be thinking with that kind of urgency and with that sense of emergency about the current cost of living crisis and about the fact that we did have reported in the press and the media at the weekend very, very high numbers of young people in Scotland now suffering malnutrition.
John, did you want to come in there as well?
Yeah, in terms of the joined up, I think there is progress, and I think we have to acknowledge that progress. So within Scottish Government, there's a Child Poverty Programme Board, which is trying to bring together directorates, moving beyond the silo approaches to try and avoid those inconsistencies across different departments and try to work more effectively together. Locally, we've got the local child poverty action reports, and I can't stress enough that should be the vehicle for more collaborative working locally, understanding the place of education in that broader effort to tackle poverty alongside the whole gamut of services that a local authority and a local health board provide. So there is, I think, progress towards more collaborative working, which should be more effective. In terms of good practice, I'm going to unashamedly give a plug for something that literally tomorrow we'll be starting. We've got some funded by a Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust to develop a good practice directory for tackling poverty locally, which is something that the sector's been crying out for quite some time. And the thinking is, as Andrea says, there's a lot of good work being done, but we need to find a way of sharing that more effectively. Now, in education, I think you're better than other sectors at sharing good practice. I think it has to be done more broadly across all manner of services in Scotland. But Andrea also mentioned there about what's not working, and I think we've got to be comfortable and confident to share that learning as well, because if we're going to try and solve the problem, we're going to try new things, and not everything is going to work. And I think we've got to be mature enough to let some things go as well. So it's not just a case of let's add. I think sometimes we have to take away, and that's a tougher decision to make. And the kind of leaders amongst us have got to be sending the right messages out to our practitioners and our staff that it's okay to fail, providing that we learn from that failure as well, and it's done with the right intentions. So I think there is progress. I think education, in some local child poverty action reports is much more central than others, and I'd like to see in all of these 32 reports that the value of education, both short-term and long-term, been something that's recognised much more widely than it currently is.
Thanks, John. And before we move on to considering some of the other kind of barriers to attainment, I wonder if I can just ask one kind of final poverty-related question. So yesterday I was interested to see the Audit Scotland Tackling Child Poverty briefing, and one of the criticisms they had was that policy and spending are focused on helping children out of poverty rather than long-term measures to prevent it. And I guess I wondered what your take on that was.
Yeah, I think you've got to fire on all fronts, if I'm honest about it. You've got to deal with the crisis it presents just now. If all our money was invested in long-term solutions to poverty, then we would be letting some children down in the here and now, and we can't do that. We simply cannot afford to ignore the crisis it presents at the current time. But I think our strategies have got to, and it's not asking for everything, our strategies logically have to deal with crisis as it presents just now, but also future-proof to make sure that, you know, in 10 years' time we're not having the same debates, and that we're shifting resources in a way that's effective and we're using our resources appropriately to deal with those long-term problems. And I can see the kind of seedlings of that happening. I'll be honest. I mean, and certainly again, these local reports, and I've been monitoring them for a few years now, and thinking of the national strategies, it's moving in the right direction. If I was to give a state of the play where we're at, I think the foundations are in place, and I think the next 3 or 4 years are absolutely critical. Absolutely critical if we're going to make the types of changes that have to be made. And again, I'm not party political, but I really do think we have to flag up the Scottish Child Payment as well, which is a significant difference to what's been done south of the border. Putting pounds and pence in the pockets of our more financially challenged families in Scotland. And the modelling is suggesting that we're actually going to meet our interim targets for tackling child poverty as we look towards 2030. Now, I know we've got a cost of living crisis, and that's almost going to pull the rug from under your feet if that progress has been made. But it gives us an idea of what we can do. You know, if we're motivated enough, if we believe in tackling poverty, we do have tools at our disposal that we can use more effectively. And I think what you should see in the next few years is more of a divergence between Scotland and the other nations and regions in the UK, and that our child poverty rates will be bad, but they will be much better than they are south of the border because of the decisions that we are taking here in Scotland.
Thanks. Douglas, do you want to go in? Yep.
It might seem a bit kind of left field, but I think in terms of education's role in addressing poverty in the longer term, I think we need to be teaching young people to ask questions about why am I poor? You know, like there is, you know, that, you know, give a person a fish, you know, like they'll eat for that day, you know, teach them how to fish, they'll eat for a week. Well, get them to ask why is it living in a subsistence manner. Ask questions that are rooted in social justice. I think we need to be educating young people to be activists. I mean, it's great to see Jordan here, young person, clearly an activist. It would be great if more young people were coming out of school asking serious questions about the nature of society and the way the world's set up. People leaving school critical of the world around them, asking serious questions rooted in social justice. If they're leaving school with those critical faculties, with a sense of activism, with a passion to change the world around them and not just fit into the world rational and productive, our education system should be producing young people that will challenge the world around them and not just accept this is the way it is. That in part has to be part of the long-term solution, and maybe that's a naive middle-class view of the world, but I still think we should be producing young people who are willing to tackle the situation as it is at the moment.
And to recognise the situation that they actually are in.
I think one of the things that I've kind of been reflecting on in my head, much of what I'll go on to talk about when we look at some of the other barriers are related to prejudice and bullying, and also prejudice-based bullying, identity, and so on. And I think when we're talking about poverty in the context of attainment, I actually think it's quite good that we do have representatives on this panel who work in fields of, for example, anti-racism or racial literacy or prejudice or bullying or LGBT anti-discrimination, because I don't think that we can separate what are often seen as health and well-being issues or broader inclusion issues from actually being a fundamental aspect of attainment. Much of what we've kind of spoke about so far has been related to different measures that schools can put in place to improve young people's attainment effectively within the school community. So things like free school meals, things like investment. I think one of the things that I would probably quite like to point out is that we know that poverty is in and of itself, along with social class, along with identity, one of the more common motivating factors of prejudice and bullying behaviours and discriminatory behaviours that young people can experience in school. As an organisation, in 2020, during the onset of the first COVID-19 pandemic lockdown in the spring of that year, we partnered with Professor Ian Rivers at Strathclyde University to look at what young people's experiences were online as education settings closed and young people moved onto online environments. And what we were really interested in was what was the impact of the closure of schools on young people's experiences of prejudice, on their experiences of online bullying, but also on their experiences in relation to their own well-being and their kind of emotional confidence and resilience as schools closed. So that report, Online in Lockdown, we really done quite a deep dive into lots of the different types of prejudice that young people were experiencing, and prejudice related to socioeconomic status was up there as one of the most common alongside racism, homophobia and misogyny. So I think when we're looking at the diversity of the panel today, I am quite pleased to see that I've been doing the work that I do since I was 19. I used to not have these grey hairs, which will probably shine beautifully on these very bright lights. But for a long time, some of the work that I was doing and that colleagues across different sectors related to equalities were doing often was kind of put within, no, that's health and well-being. And I think when we are looking at attainment, we can't separate health and well-being, we can't separate inclusion, we can't separate efforts to address broader inequalities related to characteristics, and we can't separate that kind of intersectional mindset that Andrea spoke about also. Thanks, Jordan.
I think that's absolutely spot on in terms of how interconnected and related it is. Okay, so I'm keen that we've spoken a lot about poverty, and I'm keen that we, in the kind of time we have left, look at some of our other key issues and bring Gemma into the conversation as well. I wonder, Gemma, if you might like to contribute a little bit, and I know this was something we were talking about prior to us starting. I was wondering about learning gaps caused by the pandemic, and Jordan, you were talking about the research that had been done of people's experiences through the lockdown, and I just wondered, Gemma, if you wanted to say a little bit on your experience in terms of those learning gaps, we were talking about that earlier, how that's impacted people across the whole spectrum, so the whole spectrum of learners, right from early years right through to college and university students. You know, does it exist across all those levels, those kind of gaps caused by the pandemic? And what's your kind of thoughts on what we need to do to tackle that in terms of attainment and maybe a bit of a sense of how large that challenge is?
Something small. I think feeding back onto the issue with poverty that we were kind of talking about, I do think, as Jordan was saying, it's so intrinsic to the personhood of the young people that they are feeling insecure and unsafe as a result of not having material things, of not having food security, not having, knowing that they're going to have a warm house to go back to. Nobody can learn in a situation where they are feeling unsafe and insecure about themselves, and that's why all the issues that maybe have before been put aside as that kind of, these are equalities add-ons, are so intrinsic, is because they are to do with that personhood, and young people need to feel comfort and need to feel comfortable and safe and accepted in order to be able to achieve in any way, shape or form. So really anything we're doing that isn't dealing with that, who they are as people, is a plaster on a big open wound. And I think that's even more clear now that we're in this post-COVID situation where young people have missed out on so much, and not just lost learning, but so much socially. I mean, when we were talking earlier, I was saying a lot of the difference with the young people that I've got in front of me is I'm looking at S3s who emotionally are feeling more like P7s, who aren't ready emotionally for the kinds of texts that I would have done at National 5 with other cohorts, who aren't able to collaborate and work together in the same way that I've seen other young people of the same age. They've missed out not only on the actual physical learning and the ability to do X, Y, and Z and the foundational things that they need from that BGE curriculum, but also they seem to have, or the bigger issue is they seem to have lost that social time and that ability to kind of interact with each other and be able to work together well and be able, they're much shyer than they used to be. There's a lot of awkwardness. A huge amount more young people don't want to speak in front of each other. You get a lot, I'm the horrible mean person who has to make them do solo talks and things. And it's incredible the amount of young people now that you're getting letters from parents saying, oh, do you know what, they can't speak in the classroom and they just couldn't do it. And that lack of confidence is hugely noticeable, maybe more noticeable even than the actual learning that's been missed, I would say.
Thanks, Gemma. Does anyone else want to kind of jump in on that? Or?
My reflection on the kind of issue of learning loss was that it was the youngest and the poorest who seemed to miss out most, because if you were, you know, like age kind of 9 upwards, you could do a degree of work on your own without an adult working with you at home. But if you're a, you know, like 5, 6, 7-year-old, you needed an adult working with you, and no matter how many devices you had, it was no good unless you had somebody doing it with you. So it seemed to me, a reflection when we kind of came back to school in the first set of kind of ACEL data looking at it, it was the youngest and the poorest who missed out. So again, it emphasises that poverty is the key issue, is the central issue in terms of outcomes in education. And so we, reflecting again on what Gemma was saying, we just need to be careful not to go back to business as usual too quickly in education. You know, there are still issues because of what has gone on over the last 2 years, the interruption, the disruption, the disconnect, that sense of if school's open, you go to school, that commitment to just routinely going to school and the expectation you'll go to school all the time. Trying to get kids back into school, into that routine, it's become a wee bit easy to just not go. You know, attendance looks like it's down, it's not recovered fully to what it was. If you're not in school, you're not going to learn. So there are still issues for us as a system to work through, and I think that will be there for the next 2 or 3 years until we work all the way through it.
Yeah, I think what Gemma's describing is kind of like the symptoms of trauma, and I think that we've just very, very quickly forgotten that so many children and families have gone through trauma, and really pretty prolonged trauma, and we're talking about attainment, we're talking about, you know, solo talks and things like that, but we are missing the bit about the fact that daily on the news, children watched and heard, you know, the mounting death, the figures about the mounting death toll, you know, which would have been frightening for them, you know, whatever age they were, frightening for them. Some of them will have suffered bereavement, and particularly children and young people from the poorest families, because we know that the death rate was significantly higher in the poorest communities and families. And even where children didn't suffer actual bereavement, the amount of illness in their families and the worry about that, the worry about family members, and the worry just about the world and what will happen and what does this mean, and that was all against the backdrop of the climate angst that came before the pandemic. And the pandemic hasn't gone away. You know, we're still in we're still in the pandemic, albeit that we might be now moving towards, you know, the stages of it being endemic. But young people have had 2.5 years of constant messaging about the pandemic and danger and risk and health and worry and all of that. And really, we have to be thinking much more boldly about recovery and long-term recovery to get those young people over that. Not only so that they can go on and learn and achieve and all the things that we want them to do, but so that they will be like more well as people and less kind of long-term impacted by the trauma that they and their classmates and their families and their friends have just come through and to some degree are still suffering the reverberations of.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I'm conscious of time, which is fastly escaping us, and I'm also conscious that we've got Jordan here, and he's the co-founder of Time for Inclusive Education, and I wondered whether we might want to talk a little bit about our learners from the LGBT community and the barriers that they face. So we know that they face many barriers to attainment, and Jordan, I just wondered whether you wanted to give some insight and we could have a bit of discussion around the barriers that they're facing and the work that's ongoing to support them. And I guess I wondered whether you might pick up a little bit. Another theme that I was kind of keen to pick up on was if you think that we are asking those learners from those communities, are we listening to them enough? Are we asking them enough about the challenges they're facing? And are we including their viewpoints in the decisions that we're making and the policies that we're devising to support them?
I think there's definitely been improvements in terms of actually engaging young people and engaging learners within national policy developments that I've been involved in. Some of the work that myself and the organisation had done at Scottish Government level was related to advancing LGBT inclusive education, and that working group and then latterly the implementation group did engage with young people. We engaged with learners in schools, we engaged with teachers also, we engaged with families, and I actually think a lot of the development work that was done for the national policy on LGBT inclusive education does actually set quite a good model in terms of how to actually hear from the young people that you're trying to ultimately improve their experiences and affect change with the policy. I think more broadly in terms of LGBT young people's experiences within the context of attainment, for young people who actually are LGBT, it very often is related to issues of identity and then experiences of prejudice and bullying. So last year, as an organisation, we worked with just short of 6,000 secondary school pupils across Scotland, and more than 700 of those pupils took part in an evaluation process. And what we found as part of that process was that 81% of secondary school pupils reported that they regularly heard derogatory language about LGBT people at school. So that's language like, the very common phrase, "that's so gay," to more derogatory slurs or terms that I grew up hearing as a young person, being called a poof because you missed a goal in football, or being called a lesbo because you came in with a short haircut as a girl. That is still very common within school communities. I'm sure some of the teachers and education professionals in the audience and watching at home will have encountered that language either in a professional capacity or within a community. More concerning for me is that even now, still, 12 years after my experience at school, 45% of learners that we engaged with had either witnessed or experienced bullying directly on the grounds of being LGBT. And so for young people who actually are LGBT, the impact of that is directly damaging not only to attainment but to well-being and to that, as Gemma spoke about, that sense of personhood, because when you are being persecuted or targeted because of something that is so intrinsic to who you are and that you aren't able to change, this is not something that you can change overnight. It might be something that you can conceal. It's not something that can ever be changed about who you are. It feels very, very personal, and it becomes very, very difficult. People often wonder in terms of what young people's experiences are in the context of LGBT within primary schools, and within the last decade the Highland Council conducted a whole school survey of secondary school pupils, and what they found was that 44% of secondary pupils had a first memory of homophobic bullying occurring in primary school, and that tended to peak between primary 5 and primary 7. So I was that primary school pupil. I can remember some of my earliest memories at primary school are being called gay before I even knew that I was gay myself. I experienced all of that type of homophobia throughout my kind of latter half of primary school and up into secondary school also, and began experiencing more direct bullying behaviours in my first year of high school. And I've spoken about this multiple times before. I'm not going to drag the tone of it right down, but I think what I will definitely say from my experience is when I was being bullied for being gay, and this was before anyone actually knew that I was gay. I didn't come out at all in school. I left school when I was 18 and never came out at all in that environment. I didn't feel safe to. But I can still, to this day, as a 27-year-old, if I think enough about it, I can still feel that sickness in my stomach and that twisting knot that you get when you walk through the school doors and you see the people who are targeting you. They see the people that have been, in my context, sending me threats on MSN or Bebo that when I came in I was going to get, you know, X, Y and Z happen to me. I can still feel that panic and that fear and the complete distraction from what I was learning in class when people are kicking me in the back of the seat and calling me a gaydo or a gay boy. I can still feel the panic and the worry when I walked into registration class and someone put their hand up and said, "Miss, do you know Jordan's gay?" and the whole class erupts into laughter. All of that affected my ability to go to school and learn. And I loved the academic part of school. I loved going to history and modern studies, and I loved learning. I've always been someone who loves learning. But for the first few years of my time at secondary school, it was near impossible for me to take in what I was learning. It was near impossible for me to attain because I effectively walked through school worried and scared and frightened, not only that people would find out that I actually was gay, but that what I was experiencing would escalate. And so that's where the work that we do as an organisation is very much about being proactive and actually preventing those behaviours from arising in the first place. That's what the LGBT inclusive education policy in Scotland is about. And if anyone has engaged with any of the resources or the materials, you'll see that as much as it is focused on LGBT inclusive education and improving attainment for LGBT learners, one of the key things to remember about particularly homophobia is that it does not just impact young people who actually are LGBT. As an organisation, we are hearing much more from teachers within schools and also parents of young people experiencing prejudice or bullying because they have, for example, same-sex parents and they're feeling excluded or alienated at school. But homophobia in particular impacts ultimately on any young person who deviates from gender stereotypes. The reason that I was so targeted with homophobic bullying was because I was a 12-year-old boy who couldn't hold a conversation about football. My two best friends were girls, and I was, you know, massively into Rihanna. That was it. Those all indicated to other people that Jordan must be gay, and therefore that's what led to that bullying happening. Just so happened that they were right. And so I think in the context of attainment, when I think it is often quite easy to look at things like the LGBT inclusive education policy or some of the work that's going on with anti-racism or some of the work that's going on with gender-based violence and improving things for women and girls, young women and girls in school. It's quite easy to often kind of compartmentalise that and box it in different places. But I think for me as a young person, the biggest barrier to attaining and the biggest barrier that I see for LGBT young people often today is prejudice, it is bullying, it is isolation, and being proactive in your teaching and learning can help to actually prevent that.
Thanks, Jordan. So I'm just going to pick up on sort of something you said, which was that, you can't hide it. And I guess I wonder whether, a lot of the barriers to attainment you can't hide. I'm sure that some learners do try and hide those things. But I wondered whether that kind of linked in a little bit to kind of Gemma's experience and insight in terms of her work around anti-racism. And I wondered whether maybe, Gemma, you wanted to say a little bit about that, because same thing goes, you can't hide it. And I just would welcome your insight on that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you about the need for that. Actually, as a teacher, it makes me feel uncomfortable to think about that there'd be a situation where a kid in my class would raise their hand and I would not, this is such an intrinsic thing to us as professionals that we need to be literate in being able to speak about these things. We need to understand that, it might be a bit uncomfortable for us and we might not know exactly what to say, but we need to intervene all of the time. I think it's so important that it's part of the training that we receive actually as teachers, and it's a continual thing. In the same way that we look at safeguarding over and over again, I think we should be looking at race, at gender, at sexuality, at how we should be talking about this, because these are ever-present issues with young people, and especially with teenagers. These are things that are always going to be huge issues for them as they're in that adolescence. And I do think, you know, we all know relationships are the foundation of teaching. They are the thing that we need to be able to make schools work. And we can't have those relationships if we can't have honest, comfortable conversations. And I do think, I mean, because I'm always talking about race, I get a lot of people that recoil when I start to speak, because it's such a, there's that politeness overtakes you, and you think, I don't really, she said black loads of times. Like, there is that horrible kind of discomfort that comes from talking about these things, that we need to start dealing with that. We need to start putting that to the side and being like, you know what, this is a big enough issue that we just need to start having the conversation. And I do think what we do in my school really well is we have the conversation and we talk it out, and kids really appreciate having that situation where they know, even if they ask a question you don't know, you're going to be like, do you know what, let's go and have a chat, or let's go and look at something up, let's go on the Thai website, let's do whatever. So I feel like having that ethos and that culture that you know what, we're going to work it out and we're going to be inclusive whatever which way we can, I think is so necessary. And then it makes young people so much more confident in themselves to be able to be like, okay, I'm having trouble with this, or I'm struggling with that, I'm being bullied in this way, or someone saying this certain thing that I'm not comfortable with. We were really surprised when we first started the Anti-Racist Society at my school. Everyone was a bit like, is there like some horrendous issue with racism that you need to deal with? And well, no, not really, no, but the world is racist. We are living in a racist society. So being an anti-racist is just actively working against those structures that we know are already in place. And young people got that way quicker than adults did, actually. Because they're like, yeah, I just don't want to be not racist. I want to be anti-racist. I want to be like out here telling you why I feel this way. So I do think there's a lot of those kind of youth-led, young people-led groups in schools that are doing all of those things, that have that culture. Huge growth in LGBT clubs, huge growth in anti-racist clubs across schools, where young people are able to kind of lead us in that way, which I think is amazing.
Yeah. And I think you're spot on in terms of opening up the conversation, having those difficult conversations, because I think that's probably relevant to, it feels like we've barely scratched the surface in terms of barriers for learners in terms of their attainment, but I think that's so relevant in terms of so many issues. I mean, mental health is something we haven't even touched on, and probably is a huge challenge that so many of our learners are facing, so many of our staff in schools and colleges and early years establishments are facing as well. And I think you're absolutely spot on in terms of opening up those conversations. I wonder if anyone else wants to come in. Douglas, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, Jordan's experience is awful, you know, and it's heartbreaking to hear it again, and it must be hard for you living with it. And equally experience young people's experience of racism in school. But anything, I mean, that's why I go back to this issue of what do we want to do in education? What kind of young people do we want to produce in education? I want to produce young people who will not treat others as less just because of who they are, regardless of whether it's race, you know, gender identity, being neurodivergent, having a disability, just being treated as less because of who you are or some characteristic you have. I would want the education system to produce young people who will not do that, will not be like that, and will challenge that, actively challenge that when they see it. And that's why, for me, the national discussion is really important. And in Glasgow, we're starting a conversation about what's the purpose of education here in Glasgow. I think Glasgow's got it's fairly distinctive in Scotland because of the level of deprivation and because of the level of diversity in Glasgow. So that question about what's the purpose of education, the national discussion about education, because we've talked tonight about attainment, and there was reference to the Scottish Attainment Challenge. You know, attainment is absolutely crucial, and we want attainment for young people coming from deprivation to be equal to everybody else. So it's a challenge we need to deal with. But the bigger issue is, what's the purpose of education? What kind of young people do we want to produce through our education system? Because your qualifications have validity for 10 minutes. You know, they get you into college, they get you into university, they get into a job, then they're pretty much worthless. So attainment is currency to get you to the next stage. Who you are as a person stays with you for your life. If you're a person who's going to just stand back and watch homophobic bullying or racist bullying or people being treated as less because of who they are, you know, that becomes the person you are for life. I want education to produce people who will challenge that. And so it has to be about education has to be about much more than education. And that's why the national discussion on what's the purpose of education for me is really important.
Just a very, very quick note, because I completely agree. And I think just for the professionals in the audience or watching hybrid, one of the most simple things that you can do in terms of teaching young people about racism or homophobia or misogyny or sexism or any form of prejudice is to look at what you are currently including within your teaching and learning. So that doesn't matter whether you know, a lot of people think, oh, that's PSE, that's anti-bullying work. It's not. It's broader. As an organisation, we talk quite a lot about the concept of every child and young person throughout their learning pathway having mirrors and windows within their curriculum. So the idea being that every young person, regardless of their race or their sex or their sexual orientation or their culture, their religion, their family background, their social class, their socioeconomic status, every child and young person should be able to learn through a curriculum where they see a reflection of themselves. So they should be able to see themselves reflected in what they're learning. And equally, young people should be able to look through your curriculum that you're including and actually see representations of people who don't have the same experience as them, because that is how you build strong, empathetic young people who are prepared to not be bystanders, who will understand that, you know, racism and homophobia should be challenged. And why do they have that understanding? Because they actually know what it is, and as part of their teaching and learning, they've seen representation of LGBT people, they've seen representation of people of colour, they've seen representation of different rights movements, and they've seen that at natural points throughout their learning pathway. That is ultimately the power of education, and one of the simplest things that anyone can do after this panel and everything that's been spoken about is pull out your curriculum planners and say, okay, where in what I'm teaching is there an opportunity for me to maybe use, you know, can I use an LGBT person from history to emphasise a particular point of learning? If I'm doing World War II and P5, can I put in something about Alan Turing and try and engage young people in these complex areas of maths by making it a bit more energetic because we're talking about a really cool, famous code breaker? So there are ways that it can be done very effectively and ultimately that reflection in curriculum is so important, that inclusion in teaching and learning is so important, because learners who are included and reflected within what they are learning are far more likely to actually be engaged with it. So yeah.
Thank you, Jordan. I know that John and Jem are both keen to come in, but I'm also conscious of time and opening it up to questions. So what I'm going to say is I don't see any questions from the online audience. So if anybody is watching and wants to put their question in, then I would urge you to do that now, so that we can get the chance to get through it. And what I will do is, if it's okay, I'll just open up to the sort of audience here to see if we've got questions and see whether some of the things that we're going to talk about will come up anyway. So what I would ask is, if you would like to ask a question, so we've got some roving mics, if you could, it would be great if you could just introduce yourself and say who you are, and ask your question. And if you want to direct that question to a specific member of the panel, it would be really great if you could say who that is, or if it's just a general question, we'll open it up. So is there any questions from the audience here tonight?
Hello, my name is Sajda Nadeem, and I'm a supply teacher, primary school teacher in Dundee. And I just wanted to say, going back to what Jordan and Gemma were saying about reflection of themselves and representation of people of colour, I think it's really important to have positive role models in this profession, because I think teachers as a whole are very accepting and they're facilitating of differences, and they have to be. That's the way that they should be. So I think seeing more representation of people of colour and that in the teaching profession is a really important point. For example, when I was in a primary school once, I went into a classroom which was very diverse, and one of the girls sort of just sat up and said, "Oh, Mrs. Nadeem, are you a Muslim?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "So am I." And she said it with so much pride because she obviously saw that there was a teacher there that was representing her as well, and it was a positive role model for her. And that all of a sudden she just sort of perked up and said, "Oh, so am I." And she said it with so much pride, and that made me feel so good as well, that I was not just in terms of teaching, but I was actually making a positive impact on these children in other ways as well. So I think it's very important to have positive role models in that area. And I think what Jordan said about, you know, representation, and it's great to see such a diverse panel as well, and I think that's very important, definitely. Not a question, but more of a statement.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Does anyone on the panel want to kind of respond to that? Gemma, do you want to come in?
You kind of took the words out of my mouth, because that was what I was chomping at the bit to say, is I think it's so important that we have teachers of colour represented in our schools so that young people know and that's something they can aspire to be. And that is just as true of disabled members of staff, of neurodiverse members of staff, dyslexic members of staff, gay members of staff. It's necessary that they see that this is what the world is like, and it is unfortunate for us in Scotland at the minute that there is just a dearth of, particularly in leadership roles, of teachers that are representative of the young people that they're teaching, and I think that is something that needs to be focused on. I very recently was part of the Glasgow ring-fenced principal teacher jobs for BAME teachers. So they came up specifically, it was only for BAME applicants, and that's where my PT-ship has come from. And for young people at my school, when I was like, and now I'm a principal teacher, because people started like telling, people would come into my classroom and be like, "Oh, congratulations, I heard about your thing." So I would be like, "Oh, I'm a principal teacher now, guys." And they're like, "Whoa, you are?" Like, "Oh, now you can tell them what we say." You know, and that idea, already they were like, oh, there's like 3 teachers of colour in my school, and they're already, from the minute, you know, that you come in, they're already like, "Oh, I can go and talk to her about things," or like, you know, little things like that. That's just natural to humans, that you want to share with people that you think have the same view of the world as you, and being able to see that in more positions of power would be amazing, I think.
John, were you wanting to come in?
Yeah, I completely agree with that, but we can never be truly representative of everybody. I mean, if you think about us as a profession, teachers, we are middle-class professions, and, you know, our interests are largely academic, and not all of our school population will aspire to be like us. So if we're interested in role models that people can aspire to, you know, the janitor, the cleaners, and absolutely the catering staff are also really important in terms of providing role models and valuing them as part of a school community as well. Because again, not all of our young people will move on to be like us in terms of occupations. So thinking of the class perspective that Jordan touched upon, I don't think we can forget that as well. It doesn't in any way, shape or form undermine the points that have been made, but I think we have to be also mindful of the diversity of the young people that are in schools, and in many ways they will never be like us in terms of what their careers will be beyond school.
Thanks, John. I'm keen to see if we can hear from anyone else that has a question, so just opening it out to the floor again. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask?
My name's Sean Hagney. I'm the head teacher at St John's High School in Dundee. I hope this isn't party political, but I'm interested in some policy decisions of Scottish Government in terms of things like free school meals and these universal provisions. And in the panel's view, are approaches like that the best way of tackling poverty? Or would it be more effective to use that same sum of money to target and better target some of our young people who are impoverished and suffering from malnutrition and all the rest? And I suppose a part B to that question in relation to the title of this, Placing Learners at the Heart of Scottish Education. What's the role of teachers in that, as the pie gets smaller and the cost of living bites everyone, but we see it in terms of our teachers, is that we also have strike action possibly taking place amongst our staff, looking for a bigger slice of that ever-decreasing pie. So how do we properly place learners at the heart of Scottish education?
Thank you for that question. Andrea, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'll start, and I'll start with your second question. So on the point about you know, the potential for strike action, I don't know if you picked up on Friday the outcome of the EIS ballot, which saw 78% of our members engage in the ballot, and 91% of them vote in favour of strike action in pursuit of a fairer settlement. You know, that's indicative of the strength of feeling that there is amongst Scotland's teachers about the offer, the 5% offer that's on the table currently, which amounts to almost an 8% real terms pay cut. And you know, teachers see that as you know, just another facet of what we consider to be underinvestment in education. We see it that Scottish Government and UK Government need to invest more in education, because, as we were just talking about a couple of questions ago, education is a social good. It's not just about what we do with the children and young people who are in front of us, you know, for the 12 years that we have them from P1 to S5, or the 13 years that we have them, you know, from P1 to S6. It's about that they're an investment in our society, and you know, you were kind of suggesting maybe a bit of a dichotomy there between investing in teachers and investing in teacher salaries and putting young people at the centre of our education system. We absolutely see it, that in order to ensure that we can attract good, high quality graduates and people who are going to be committed and dedicated in the way that we need them to be to our young people, then we have to offer competitive salaries, to the graduate cohort, basically. Otherwise, we're going to risk losing large numbers of people who would be brilliant teachers to other professions, and we're already seeing that kind of trend. So we don't see a dichotomy between paying teachers properly and prioritising the needs of young people, because we care about the education system, we care about children and young people, that we want to see good teachers and good teachers well rewarded for their efforts. On your question about universalism, we consider that to be the most inclusive way of going about ensuring that the most vulnerable of our children and young people, most disadvantaged, are fed, that they have access to nutritious food in the course of a school day and over holiday periods, we would argue as well. And it's not just about that being free, like cost-free at the point of, at the point of use. It's also about it being stigma-free, because we understand that lots of young people, particularly the older age groups, the P6s and P7s, and then when the kids get into secondary, they will actually actively dodge going to the canteen because there's stigma associated with that. And I know that over the last decade or so, we've done better on that to try and make it less visible that a young person is relying on free school meals, but we have from our own research and research that has been done by other organisations, that young people will often go hungry during the school day rather than be visible as being the ones in the canteen who can't go down the high street and go to Greg's or go to the chip shop or go and get a roll and sausage or whatever it is. We know that there's a lot of stigma associated with free school meals uptake, and we would like to see that eradicated, along with the health inequalities that there are in so many young people, not having regular and sufficient access to nutritious food every day.
Thanks, Andrea. I know there is probably a lot more that the panel want to add to that, but we are almost out of time, and I can't believe that amount of time has passed and we have literally just scratched the surface. So I really just wanted to say thank you so much again to our panel. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for your insight and your input and your openness, and thank you very much to our audience who've come in person and to those of us who have joined online. So that's pretty much us. I'm sure the conversation will continue as the evening progresses and we all head home, but thanks for your engagement and your time tonight. It's really very much appreciated. I'm now going to hand over to David Burgess, who is going to close things out for us.
Thank you very much. So I'm David Burgess.